Now we're on the chapter of how to hold title. There are 4 ways to hold title. We'll go over those 4 and then we'll go into detail of each one. So let's go ahead and look at the slide. The first way to hold title is severalty. Severalty is one person holding title. So a single person can hold title. Widow, husband and wife. Now husband and wife doesn't mean both of them. If one party decides to buy a property without the other party, he can hold title in severalty. Corporation as well. The second way to hold title is joint tenancy. 2 or more parties. 2 or more parties would be individuals or husband and wife. Corporations cannot hold title because there's a right of survivorship and corporations cannot die. The third one is tenancy in common. Tenancy in common, a legal person can hold title. Again, joint tenancy you can't, but tenancy in common you can. There is a probate that goes along with that. We'll discuss it in more detail. Husband and wife can hold title in tenancy in common. There is a tax implication on the way you hold title, and we'll go into that as well. The last one is community property. Community property is only husband and wife. Corporations cannot hold title in community property. One of the ways to hold title is joint tenancy. Let's go over the details of that. Joint tenancy, you have to have 4 unities right here, 4 unities. Unity of time and unity of title. That means all of the parties must close at the same time, and they all have to take title at the same time. And unity of interest means if you have 2 parties and it's half-half, or 3 parties and each one will have 1/3, 1/3. And unity of possession, all must reside in equal rights of possession. Now the advantage of joint tenancy is that there is no probate. No probate means that you don't have to go to court once a party dies. It goes right to the surviving parties on title would be the right of survivorship. No obligation to debt to a surviving tenant. That means if 2 parties and one party has accumulated a lot of, let's say Macy's debt, if he dies, the other party, the surviving party, does not inherit that debt. That would be creditor's debt, okay? The disadvantage is that if one party decides to sell his portion of it, he does not need approval from the other party. The second way to hold title is tenancy in common. Let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of that title. Now, tenancy in common, the only unity that you have is called unity of possession. Now, possession means, this is called the undivided interest, which means if one party has 1/2 of the interest, the other has 1/2, it does not mean that they can only live in 1/2 of the house. It means undivided interest, they can have possession of the entire property. The advantages of tenancy in common is that you can sell or pass your interests to whoever you want. That is really popular in second marriages, and we'll go over that in the Q&A a little bit later. The disadvantage of tenancy in common is probate. Probate, that means it will actually, you have to go through court and you have to have a probate attorney, and all your creditors, all your assets are frozen by the creditors. So that delays a lot of process. And also, the other thing is the problem of selling property. Now, partition lawsuit happens in tenancy in common as well as joint tenancy, which means if one party decides to sell the property, not just his interest, but the entire property, and the other does not and disagrees, and there's a dispute, they have to go to court, and the court will, and it's called a partition lawsuit, the court will decide how to split the property. The third way to hold title is community property. Community property has a lot of tax implications, and I'll show you how that works, the advantages and disadvantages. Now, remember here is that if a party, one of the spouses, one spouse wants to buy, only one signature is required. All the other ones, if you want to borrow money, have a loan, or you want to sell or lease, 2 signatures are required. So only one if you buy. Here's what happens with community property. Right over here, community property has the greatest thing called step-up basis. This is what is called the tax implication advantage to community property. Let's say if you buy the property $100,000, and the time of the deceased spouse, fair market value at that point is $700,000. Now there's a $600,000 capital gains tax supposedly, but because of the community property, there is no profit tax. He keeps every penny of it. Whereas in joint tenancy, there is a formula to this, but this one's a little bit more simplified, means that you do have that capital gains tax on joint tenancy. There is that differentiation between the 2 parties. Now, the other thing is the disadvantage of community property. The question is that, is there probate in community property? In California, there is a thing called the 40-day rule. The 40-day rule means if the spouse leaves everything to the surviving spouse, then there is no probate, 40-day probate. But if he leaves even 1 penny to someone other than the spouse, then the probate applies. Okay? All right. Now, keep on going on the subject of this now. I'm going to go into a little bit different subject right here. It's called the obligation of the will of separate property. A little bit off of community property at the moment. Separate property means this: if, let's say, the spouse has purchased a property before she was married, she purchased that property on her own, and then that becomes a separate property. All right. When she marries, then she has another property with her husband. The separate property would be like this: if, let's say, she pays the bills and she has separate checking accounts or whatever, but if she somehow pay her funds through a joint account with her husband, she has commingled this, which means that she actually has given part of that separate property to the spouse. Now, the way it works is that if the separate property, if the woman died without a will and she has a separate property, then the factor would be, if she died without a will and it's a separate property, if she has 1 child, 1/2 will go towards the surviving and the other half will go toward this child. But if she has 2 or more children, then 1/3 goes to the spouse and 2/3 goes to the children. Doesn't have to be 2, it can be 3, 4, whatever, but it'd be 2/3 divided right there at this point. Community property, everything goes to the surviving spouse if you have a will or so forth. Now the last part of it would be here. All right, okay. This part would be the advantage towards community property is that step up. And the advantage toward joint tenancy is what? No probate. So why not combine both of them together? Both of them together in California, we have a new title, and that's called community property with a right of survivorship. What would be the difference between general partnership and limited partnership? Well, general partnership assumes all the liability, and the liability is personal as well as business liability. if there's a lawsuit, the person with the general liability would literally lose his own house and everything that's his own personal property. The limited partnership would be only the business liability is lost. This is why there are many, many LLCs under one general partnership. The last one is corporation. The disadvantage of corporation is that it's double taxation. So you are taxed on the dividends that you give to the shareholders, and you are also taxed on the profit you make for the corporation. That's it. That's all you need to learn about the two. We're on the topic of encumbrance, and the way we're going to present it is that non-money encumbrance or money encumbrance. We will begin with non-money encumbrance. Under that category, we have either a private restriction or a public restriction. Now look at the slides over here. The private restriction is your covenants. That's like your HOA. So you have certain promises that you have to make and conditions that like your condos, that you can't have your car wash on Sunday. Those are private restrictions. And again, the word encumbrance means burdened. You are burdened with these conditions. The second under is called the private restrictions, under again non-money encumbrance. And there are several types that you need to learn, and these are called types of zoning. The first one is called variance. Variance is when you have a specific property. Let's say your property, let's say the zoning for an overhang in a certain area, residential area, is only 4 feet, but you want to make it 10 feet. So you go to the county, the city, and you ask for a variance. That would be a specific request. That would be variance. Rezoning is when the entire block is rezoned from a residential to a commercial. Spot zoning is more of changing a small group, a little parcel of one parcel or several homes that you spot zone to change that part of it from commercial or to residential. Downzoning would be from an R4 to an R1. R4 meaning residential 4 units to an R1 residential 1 unit would be single family. Strip zoning would be like there are properties where you can buy and only one part is residential and also commercial, and it'd be just like one street that would be that way. That would be strip zoning. All right, we're going into the federal laws of discrimination. And let's go over this first. We begin with the state laws. Okay, we begin with state laws. Right over here, state laws. So, anything to do with real estate, this is again, is discrimination. Discrimination in real estate is under, called the UNRU, Civil Rights Act. Just remember the name UNRU. And what UNRU is saying is that steering is under, again, UNRU. Steering means that you cannot show homes to a client, a buyer, only a specific area based on his ethnic race. You have to show every property. And blockbusting means you cannot go to a neighborhood and blockbust, meaning panic sell, saying, well, a certain ethnic group is coming into the neighborhood, so you must sell. That's called blockbusting. The Rumford Act is more on housing. Remember, housing is to do with landlord-tenant discrimination. And that has to do, again, landlord-tenant is what? It's personal property. And this is known as the Fair Housing Act. So if somebody, a landlord does not want to rent to a certain person, he is violating the Rumford Act. Holden Act is more on lending. Lending meaning, and it's called the redlining too. That means there's remember the foreclosure times. So you, a lender, B of A, let's say, cannot say just because you have a zip code of a certain area that has so many foreclosures, I cannot lend money to you, that he's violating the Redlining Holden Act. Now, federal laws, you just need to know the Civil Rights Act is in 1968. Now, there is one more, and that is called the Jones versus Mayer on a separate page. Jones versus Mayer means this. Remember, all this has to do with the state, right? The real estate and also the Rumford Act. They were so successful on these two that they decided to make this a federal law, and that federal law is Jones versus Mayer, meaning you cannot discriminate against in real estate as well as in housing for the entire United States. All right, now the creation of an easement. There are several ways you can create an easement, and let's look at those and discuss it, okay? Here is the slide over here. Now, many ways you can create easements, and there's all this, and we'll go over the simple first and then go into more complicated ones. You can create an easement by necessity. If there's a landlocked, then you have to have an easement towards a certain gate, then you have to do it that way. And that has to do with quiet title. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Dedication, you want to dedicate to a public park and so forth, then that also is a creation of easement. Condemnation, we talked about eminent domain the first day, we talked about that. That is also a type of easement. Now, what I want to talk about is the deed and prescription. Now, remember what I said about prescription. When you have a prescriptive easement, that means you have to use somebody's side gate, and you have to use it for 5 years, and then you have, access to that side gate. However, the deed is a little different. The deed is granted to you. So if the neighbor writes a deed and grants you the use of his side gate, once he does that, you don't even have to use it. It is so pure that you don't have to act on it. It is yours permanently. So that's really something that you need to know the difference. Let's go and jump over to adverse possession, and then we'll come back to encroachment. But adverse possession, remember we talked about that it's 5 years, but you pay someone else's taxes. And once you have someone else's taxes, you have created what is called a cloud on title. And when you have a cloud on title, tainted title, you have to go through court to clear it. And that's called quiet title lawsuit. And I will give you some examples when we get together in class. The last one is encroachment. Encroachment looks like this. Here's encroachment. Encroachment is a fence over your side. Now, trees over the property line, encroachment, that can be resolved very easily by just trimming it. But if someone, your neighbor, built a fence or built whatever over your property, then he has encroached onto your property. If that is not resolved in 3 years, that belongs to your neighbor. So this encroachment is something very real that you need to understand. All right, well, we're going to talk about a dominant and servient tenement in easement appurtenant and easement engross. Again, this is non-hostile, so let's go ahead and look at the slide. Previously, we talked about hostile, meaning prescriptive easement and adverse possession. This is a non-hostile easement. So remember, we'll talk about dominant tenement and servient tenement. Dominant tenement looks like this. Let's look at the houses right over here, okay? If your neighbor has access to your house, who is burdened? You are. You are burdened, you are the servient tenement. Your neighbor is a dominant tenement because now he has benefited from the access. Easement appurtenant is always the dominant tenement. That means he has easement appurtenant. It's this, your neighbor has easement appurtenant. It's always this guy it's always pointing to the dominant tenement. The other one is easement in gross. Easement in gross is always the servient tenement, the guy that is burdened. Now, how does that happen? Now notice there's only one house. There are no two houses here. So you have your house here, but remember you have PG&E. When you buy a property, PG&E has the right to come through your gate. All right. Once you have, he has the right to come through your gate. He is the dominant. You are the servient. So when you have easement and gross, and most of us have easement and gross, it's pertaining to one property, and you are always the servient tenement. So far we talked about non-money encumbrance. Let's talk about money encumbrance. Under money encumbrance, there's general lien, involuntary, or specific lien. General lien means if you have a judgment or you don't pay your income tax, the government can actually seize all of your properties. That's why it's called general. Specific lien is either voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary is the trust deed and mortgage, if you don't pay your mortgage. And involuntary, if you don't pay your property tax or mechanics lien. They can only seize the property that you did not pay the mortgage or the property tax on. That's why it's called specific lien. The other subject is the method of collecting personal debt. Now this is personal debt, not your property. Personal debt, and how do you go about this? So let's go ahead and look at the slide. All right. Here it is. So what happens is that when you have a personal debt, let's say somebody owes you, your friend owes you $1,000, and you cannot take it back. You can't. He's not returning the money. So you have a procedure of how to go about doing this. The procedure is that first you have to file a writ of attachment. Writ of attachment freezes all his personal property, meaning his computer, his furniture. He seizes all that. That would be a writ of attachment. Now then, once the judgment is for you, you go and file what is called a writ of execution. The writ of execution allows the sheriff to go to that person's property, whatever, and claims all of his personal properties. What happens if, let's say, your friend owes you $100,000? Now, the personal property will not cover all that. So what you do is that you freeze his real property. And when you freeze the real property, you do have to be careful with this lis pendent. You cannot do it yourself. You have to hire an attorney to do this. And if you do it wrong, the judgment will be against you. So you got to be very careful. But you do need to know the difference between lis pendent, where it's freezing your real property, and a writ of attachment is freezing your personal property. All right, under money encumbrance, we have a trust deed versus a mortgage. So let's look at this now. Trust deed versus mortgage. But before we do that, we need to know about the foreclosure process. Let's see, you want to just do some vocabulary. If the lender is going to come after you, it is called a deficiency judgment. They'll come after you, okay? But in California has what is called an anti-deficiency non-recourse. That means if you have an owner-occupied, that means this is not an investment property, it is not a rental, it is your property. Purchase money loan means this is your first loan. You did not refinance. This is your first loan, and you somehow defaulted on your loan. California has this clause that says the lender cannot come after you, which means it's a non-recourse type of judgment. The other thing we're going to talk about is these two. Now these will be repeated in finance when we go into finance. And what they call it assumed loan, assumption, If there's an assumption loan, that means the buyer is responsible if you foreclose. Subject to means the seller is responsible if you foreclose. Okay? So those are some of the words that you need to know, and we'll go over a little bit more in detail. But now what we want to do is to see the difference between a trustee, California, and mortgage, which is East Coast. East Coast has mortgages. And this is so important that by understanding this, you understand why California has a trustee. Now, we want to circle some of the steps. Now, first of all, we file a notice of default. The lender, you're late on your mortgage. But notice mortgage, it goes right to court. There is no trustee per se, a third party in the mortgage end of it. It's either the lender, between the lender and the borrower, borrower and the lender, mortgagor and mortgagee. There is no third party. So if the court comes into this whole thing. Now you also have then remember the trustee comes in and you have what is called the trustee sale. All right, trustee sale, and you can reinstate. The borrower can reinstate 5 days prior to the actual sale, and then they hold the trustee sale right there. However, in mortgages, you can't do it. The court has to order a foreclosed sale, and which takes time on this thing. All right. Then let's keeps on jumping back. Now let's go ahead. Now the highest bidder it goes to the highest bidder, cash, all cash, to buy a foreclosure property. There's no redemption period. Now let me show you what redemption period means. Look at this step 6 under mortgage right here. Redemption period on the East Coast means this. If there's no deficiency sought, that means if the lender does not want to come after you, the lender still has to wait 3 months after the sale to get your property. If the lender wants your property, which is called the deficiency, the lender has to wait 1 year after the sale to get your property. You can understand why California is not favorable of the mortgage. That's why we have the trustee. Another way of money encumbrance is called a mechanic's lien. And let me show you the steps of how it works. Mechanic's lien applies to if you hire a contractor and you don't pay the contractor, that's when he files a mechanic's lien. Now let's go over this here. First of all, when you have when you hire a contractor, the first thing the contractor does is give you a preliminary notice. He files his notice within 20 days of the project, at the start of the project. The preliminary notice tells you that if you don't pay after the project is finished, that he will file a mechanic's lien. All right? Now, when the completion is done on the project, the owner has 10 days to file. 10 days to file the notice of completion. Now, if he files a notice of completion, the owner, then the contractor has 60 days, and the subcontractors has 30 days to file a mechanic's lien if you don't pay them. But if you didn't file, the owner does not file or did not file the notice of completion, then all contractors have 90 days to claim and to collect money from you. I'm going to jump over right here, notice of non-responsibility. And this is more of a landlord issue. That means if a tenant decides to hire a contractor to paint his apartment, and the apartment is, then the tenant says, okay, go ahead, send the bill over to the landlord. The landlord has 10 days from the date of discovery. That means he discovers there is a contractor on site. Within those 10 days, he goes and files a non-responsibility. That will prevent him from being sued by the contractor. This is a way to protect the landlord. The declaration of homestead. declaration of homestead is only for unsecured loans. That means if you have a creditor's debt, you owe Macy's, let's say $30,000, and you're about to go bankrupt, about to file bankruptcy. Before you do so, you go to the courthouse and you file a declaration of homestead. Let me show you how that works here. Declaration of homestead, again, it's personal, it's unsecured, okay? Now, the way it works is this. These are the exemptions amount that you are exempted. So let me just push this a little bit over so you can see this. Example, if you have a home that's $160,000 and the loan amount is $100,000, you have an equity of $60,000. All right? You owe, your judgment is against you for $3,000. You have to pay that $3,000. But because your equity, and remember that exemption we talked about? It ends up being zero. You owe that $3,000. You don't owe anything. You just walk away from it. All right. Now look at property B. Property B is that against 160, but your loan amount is lower, 75. You have more equity. Okay. Against 75,000 applies, but from that you have available unsecured debt available to the creditor is 10,000. You have 3,000 right over here. You pay back 3,000, okay? You have $7,000 supposedly in your pocket. But there's a catch to this. So let me explain this. Remember that 7,000? I'm going to go to the next slide right now. And that is over here. Over here. All right. Now, this is not on the state exam, this is just for your information. Whenever you buy a house, automatically we have an automatic homestead exemption. Automatic. You don't have to file, you don't do anything, it's always that. The problem with this one is that once you file a homestead, you cannot do it anymore because it's an automatic. However, if you want to go to the courthouse yourself and file this thing, then you have another chance of filing another homestead. But there is a 6-month rule that applies. That means within 6 months, you must sell your home. You remember that $7,000 we talked about? You have to pay it back, okay? In order to file another homestead exemption. So this is just for your information. Again, if you do it yourself manually, you do have another chance of filing. If you go ahead and have an automatic one, then this is just a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We're on the chapter of agency. Let's do some definition of agency. On your handout, you have parties, the names of parties. Principal, for the state exam purpose, means seller. Agent means the seller's agent. Third party is the buyer. In reality, principal can be seller or buyer. So anyway, but on the state exam, we're going to skip sub-agent in 1 minute, okay? Cooperating agent is the buyer's agent. The sub-agent is really, for example, you're a listing agent, you're listing the house, but you have to go to Hawaii for 2 weeks. So you hire a sub-agent, somebody within your company or outside your company, and she does all the calls and she does all the open houses for you. You pay her a commission, part of your commission, and that person is your sub-agent. Now, creation of power of attorney. Power of attorney means that you have given somebody else the right to do everything, the money and everything goes to that person. It's tremendous amount of power. The person who writes the power of attorney, the person who's executing the power of attorney is called the attorney in fact. So for example, let's say you have a closing and your buyer is not able to be there in escrow to sign. So he wants his brother to do it. So what you do is that you have what is called a power attorney. Now power attorney is an eternity. So you want to have a specific power attorney to make the timeline, maybe for 2 weeks. so that the brother can sign and everything will be all right while the principal is out of town. So this is where the power or specific power attorney comes in. All right, we're talking about the creation of agency. There's several ways you can create agency, and let's look at this. Okay, all right, let's begin with creation of agency, what's called agreement. Agreement. Now, in your handout, I said actual agency. Agreement really means, let's say a seller, a principal, hires an agent to sell his property. They have an agreement. Everything is transparent. Therefore, it's an actual agency. That's easy to understand. But the other part is this part right here. I want to explain this because it's very difficult to understand this, so we're going to make it real simple. Now, ostensible agency is an act that you, most ostensible agency happens between either a seller or a buyer. Normally, it's seller or buyer who's committing a false act, who's misled other parties, okay? I'll give you an example in a few minutes. Now, he has to commit this ostensible agency, violated it, then he's taken to court, and the judge comes in and stops him by estoppel. So let me give you an example. Ostensible agency is when, let's say, a buyer hires or misleads agent A to show him homes. And he hires agent B to show him homes. What he does is that because agent B is his family and he's obligated, so he writes up a contract with agent B. Agent A is left out because he did all the work. So what happens is that the buyer has created an ostensible agency. He has misled. He has made it apparent. Seems like the agent A was his sole and exclusive buyer's agent. So agent A sues, goes to court, and the court estoppels, by estoppel meaning stopping the buyer, fine him for his act of creating an ostensible agency. We have more examples later on in class. The other one is called agent by ratification. Ratification, you remember actual agency is when the seller goes and hires an agent? Well, ratification is completely opposite. It's like 180 degrees. Here, let me give you a scenario. What it means is, let's say a seller really is thinking about selling a house, but he didn't tell anybody. But the buyer's agent does not have any contract with the seller, comes to the seller and says, I have a buyer for you, and he's willing to pay so and so. The seller goes, great, let's draw up a contract. It's a second move rather than the first move. So this is a agency by ratification, meaning the seller is now ratifying. That means he's changing, amending his agreement, let's say. Then he draws up a contract, and that's called agency by ratification. Let's talk about the difference between a single agency and a dual agency. All right. Everybody knows that single agency is just between one broker and one seller or one party principal. Dual agency, however, is a broker representing both the seller and the buyer. And there are several ways that are under dual agency. Let's look at your handout. Okay, dual agency happens in a lot of things that are you're not even aware of. If you go to an open house and the listing agent gives you comparables, properties sold in the neighborhood, he has become a dual agent because that duty belongs to the buyer's agent. Making suggestions to the buyer. He makes suggestions by saying, this area, you need to have a home inspection. You need to do this, and you need to have an appraisal. Whatever it is, that is a buyer's agent duty. He has crossed the line, he becomes a dual agent. The other one is in-house agent. A lot of times, particularly when a broker is so large that they have hundreds of agents, they don't want to share that with everybody else in the entire valley. So they don't even put it on the MLS. They have it in-house. That means only their own agents can do the bidding and so forth, and they have become a dual agent. Under the same brokerage, the same thing again, is somewhat similar to what I said, but under the brokerage. In other words, they can go on the MLS, but the buyer's agent and the seller's agent is under the same brokerage. That would be a dual agent. Crossing the line. When you are a buyer's agent, you can only talk to the seller's agent. You can't talk to the seller. So you have crossed the line in that sense, because if you talk to the seller, you have become the seller's agent, and that you have become a dual agent. The one thing, a dual agent is not illegal, it's not in violation. The only thing is that if you are a dual agent, you have to disclose everything. All material facts must be disclosed. The only thing you cannot disclose is the price. Meaning, you can't say the seller is willing to come down or go up or whatever regarding price. That is the one thing you cannot do. Okay. Commingling of funds. Commingling fund meaning a broker has to have a trust fund. Okay? So when the deposit money, the earnest money comes in, he sends it over to his trust fund. But the rule under this is that he monthly, at the end of the month, he has to only maintain $200 as a balance. All the funds have to be dispersed or whatever, pay to whatever it is, but the balance cannot be more than 200. The second thing is that if the trust fund has the commission money of the agents, he must not maintain the commission's money more than 25 days. And there's a reason for that. Sometimes the broker keeps the money for a long time. BRE is saying they want to make sure that the broker pays the commission of the agents, so they cannot keep more than 25 days.